Hello, welcome to Let's Talk About Brand. I am your host, Christine Gritmon. This week's conversation about branding with conversations was a really great conversation. Our guest, Brooke B. Sellas, literally wrote the book on brand conversations and how they're such an important part of both customer care and brand impression. We talked about different ways that those conversations can take place, whether public social media, dark social, one-on-one, all of that. We talk about the team that you should have in place and how you should prepare them to make sure that those conversations put the best foot possible forward for your brand. And we delved into the position of emerging technologies such as chat and AI when it comes to customer conversations. All right, let's get into it. I'm so excited to be having this conversation about conversations with this week's guest. This week's guest is Brooke B. Sellas. I've been wanting to have her on the show forever. I'm so excited that we're finally getting to have this conversation. Brooke is the founder and CEO of B Squared Marketing, which is a social-first marketing agency that has a special focus, especially nowadays, on customer care. And part of that focus is also carried through in Brooke's book, Conversations That Connect. So without any further ado, let's bring Brooke on. Brooke, welcome.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here with you, especially after we got to spend time IRL last week or the week before.
I know. Well, by this point, it'll be like a couple months ago.
Okay. But that one time in that one place.
That one time in that one place. I'm sure there'll be other times by this point because, we keep running into each other in the same fabulous social media marketing circles. And I've really been loving seeing sort of your shift recently because, of course, you've been, a digital marketing agency speaking about digital marketing in general. But recently, you've really been leading the conversation on conversations. I feel like that's really been not a pivot, an evolution. And I'd actually love to start by hearing how that came about and why conversations became the conversation that you are at the forefront of now.
Thank you. Well, thanks. That's a huge compliment, and I really appreciate it. And it was really a holistic, natural, organic pivot. We have been doing social media for our clients for over 10 years, and as we started to converse with them about the services that we provide for some of our like middle market and enterprise size brands who have a higher volume of conversations happening on social, they started asking us if we could help them manage that, because what they found inherently was that there was a mismatch between internal customer support or service and social media customer service. Because ultimately, your internal employees usually work Monday through Friday from 9 to 5, and social's 24/7. So what was happening, and what happens, I hear this often even now, is that the internal customer support team just can't keep up with phone, email, and social, and the fact that social is 24/7. So they bring us in to kind of handle all of that social media care, which involves both retention, obviously taking care of the customer, but also includes acquisition or finding revenue sources on social media through organic social media, not paid.
So we're of course going to talk about why this is important and good for the brands, but I also want to focus on the fact that there's a mental health crisis among social media managers, largely because not all companies really do separate out who is posting the funny memes versus who has to deal with irate customers or even not irate customers. I mean, it's not always negative interaction when you're having those customer care conversations, but it really is important that those teams are in sync. Actually, last year I was in London with Adweek, and I interviewed Michael Corcoran from Ryanair, and now Ryanair is Yeah, Ryanair certainly has some irate customers, and they sort of almost pride themselves on that. And I asked him, I said, "So, how do you ensure that it doesn't completely overwhelm and bum out your social media staff?" And part of it is that they do separate it out. They have their customer care social media handled separately, and they post, regularly in regular interviews on their social regular intervals on their social. Hey, if you have a problem, it doesn't go here, it goes over there to that support line. What do you think about that idea of separating them out? Because airlines are a good example, but I know that some companies do that. They have sort of separate support channels versus their sort of branding channels. How do you feel about that? Do you think that it's a good idea sometimes for them to be separate? Or do you think it's just a matter of being front facing the same, but having different people maybe on the back end?
No, I think it should absolutely be separate, and what we've seen is that the brands who do separate it are more successful. So, if you think about it this way, your content, whether it's an outside agency or an internal team, is really its own thing. It is not the same as customer care because we're talking about things like digital body language, being able to walk a customer through a troubleshooting situation through a digital channel. We're talking about acquiring customers through social. So being a salesperson. So creatives and content creators are much different than people who both help retain the customer and acquire the customer. So we have actually kind of two sets of people happening on our customer care teams, those who are focused on acquisition and sales, because that's very different than someone who's focused on, say, retention or troubleshooting with a client when they have an issue that they want to be walked through on their channel of choice, which happens to be social.
Ooh, I'm so glad you mentioned content because that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. A lot of times when companies think of social media, they think of putting content out there, almost as a broadcast just to be consumed. Maybe some of the smart ones are realizing that ideally the content should be conversation starters, but you recognize in your company and your clients recognize the importance of conversations not only happening in the comment threads and with shares and all of that, but also in those DMs. So, can we talk about the different types of conversations that happen with a brand on social?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, where a lot of brands are still missing out, and literally pains me to say this, but a lot of brands still aren't responding to the comments that they do receive on those social media posts or in their DMs. So, first and foremost, let's start there, right? Because that's reactive. When you're waiting for people to come to you, that's a reactive conversation. If you want to get proactive, we have to talk about things like social listening. But before I get into that, the conversations are so important because we are not starved for content as consumers, right? If you could go think of an amazing, what you think is unique post right now, go to Google and see that there's 1,000 other posts on that same topic. So we're not starved for content. What we're starved for as consumers is connection. And more, especially as millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha start to take over as the biggest buying power groups, they choose brands based on a brand's core values. They want to align their own core values as a human with the brand's core values. And how do you convey that as a brand? Through conversation, right? So a lot of the content that we see right now from brands is really what we call cliche and fact based. It's very factual. It talks about features. That's all great and fine, but it doesn't do anything to move the relationship forward or to convey to your would be buyer that they should connect with you and that your values do align. The only way that happens through content from brands is conversation around opinions and feelings, both as the brand and then the brand asking those questions of their audiences, which then leads to collection of voice of customer data. And not to get super nerdy, but we all know Google's, third-party cookies are going away. What's the answer to that? First party data. How do you get first party data? First party relationships. So brands really need to start focusing on the brand conversation and not just thinking about content, content, content.
One thing I really love about that is that it's sort of part of the overall evolution of consumer brands, sort of product based, or, where it's not, a person, are sort of taking more leaves from the personal branding book, simply because branding is personal and the relationships that consumers have with brands is increasingly personal. And personal brands could learn from this as well. There are certainly personal brands out there, people who are maybe prominent in their industries, who are also not responding to their comments, not even responding to DMs. And the Maya Angelou quote that, certainly applies to branding: people will forget what you did, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And if how you made them feel was ignored, there you have it. Um,
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that's what we tell our clients. A lot of clients, again, want to talk about facts. Like, here are the features of our products, and that is very factual, but it's emotionless, right? Talk about the benefits of what your product or your service does, because that's where you get into how people feel using your product or service. So you can connect with very brand related, sales driven content, but you have to be really mindful of how you make it emotional so that you can make that connection, so that you can converse. And then only once you've connected truly and started conversing with would-be customers will they actually get to conversion.
And this also plays very deeply into a big conversation in social media right now, which is social media a sales channel? And does
Mm.
it need to be? Because of course, if you look at, chief revenue officers and functions like that, they'll say, well, everything really needs to have an aim towards conversion. But then if you talk to some social media managers, they'll say this is a branding channel. Like, not
Mhm.
everything can be about conversion. So I'd like to kind of get some of your thoughts on social media. Is it a sales channel? Is it not? And how do those conversations play into that, regardless of if it's a sales channel or if it's, primarily a branding channel?
So for our clients, we always look to their audiences and customers to tell us what the channel is, right? So when I was writing the book, we went to all of our customer care clients and we said, how much of the social chatter that's happening, on your brand's pages or around your brand on social, do you think is acquisition versus retention? Meaning, how many people are asking like sales questions, buying questions, those pre-purchase, I'm in the moment and I'm trying to gather information to buy. And how much of it do you think is I've already purchased and I have a problem or I need troubleshooting or whatever it is? And across the board, all of our clients told us that 0 to 5% of the chatter would be acquisition. However, when we went to their social channels and we audited each channel and we started tagging all of the conversations as either acquisition or retention, what we found was that all of them, each and every one of them, had at least 20% acquisition chatter happening on their social channels. And some of our clients, more consumable goods, products, had upwards of 80% acquisition on some of their product lines on social. That's money sitting on the table. So if you're not looking at your conversations to kind of understand what is sales and what is retention and addressing that and making the sale and closing the sale through that channel of choice or on social, you're missing out on money. So I think almost anyone could have social be a sales channel, but let your audiences tell you whether it is or not.
So this sort of plays into what we talked about before, about how there's, social media that's about content, maybe engagement. There's social media that's about customer care. Now there's also social media that's about acquisition and retention and all of those things. Again, do you think that, what's needed is sort of better training so that it's part of the social media manager's job to understand their part in the overall sales funnel? Or do you think it's a time when they should have someone on the back end who they can kind of hand it off to, who's maybe on the sales team?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the company and how it works. But again, typically when we talk about a social media manager, this is not someone who is, experienced in a sales position. Maybe you found yourself a unicorn and they are, in which case good for you. And yes, they could absolutely help lead that initiative for acquisition through customer care on social. But assuming they're, your average social media manager who probably isn't into, doesn't like, or have sales experience, then yes, you need to have someone come in who works with that social manager or social team to triage, that's what we call it, these conversations that are happening, right? What is available that we can close right then and there on social? How do we provide attribution measures to closing that conversation on social? And if it's not something that we can handle, how do we fix that? So I'll give you an example. One of our tech brands, the one that had the 80% acquisition chatter happening on one of their product lines, found that a lot of those questions that people were asking in the buying moment were frequently asked questions that they had never seen or heard before. So what we did was help their sales team understand what some of these FAQs were and decide whether or not we should make, a text version of this information that would be helpful to close the deal, or whether it should be like a video, because again, this is a tech brand. So could we give them some show me content on how to fix whatever that question was, which is super valuable when somebody's in the buying moment. So I'll give you an example. Somebody comes through and they say, "Hey brand, is this printer compatible with Alexa?" And I'm able to say, as the social person or the social selling person, "Hey Christine, absolutely it is. Here's a video on how that works. And if you use the promo Let's Talk About Brand, we'll give you $100 off your purchase." That's how it's done.
So it sounds like there really need to be some sort of guidelines in place for when someone hands it off. So, social media manager doesn't say, "I don't know, look at the website."
Yeah, do not
So
send them to the website. Please
yeah,
don't.
so do you help brands put together sort of the guidelines and that flow for when things maybe need to flow to other teams? Do they kind of tell you what kind of awareness is there around that need on those teams and around training sort of on that process for when it needs to be triaged by someone in another area?
I love that question. So, yes, a lot of it is training, and we do both. We can come in and train teams on how to do it themselves in house, but we also do what we call, done for you social media customer care. And this is where a lot of clients who have that high volume of social, whether it be acquisition or retention or both happening on their social channels, just bring us in to handle it. Because, as you mentioned earlier, there is a mental health crisis that's happening around social media, especially in the past few years. And so it's an automatic value add for them to take that stress and anxiety off of their social team so that that team can focus on content. But also because, as I mentioned too, employees typically work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And when do you think these emergencies and questions happen? At night, on the weekends, and definitely on a holiday when nobody's in the office.
So that actually brings us to another thing that is a huge topic in your world, I'm sure, which is chatbots, AI, separate things, but of course they're increasingly merging. What do you feel are good practices for using chatbots and or AI to facilitate some brand conversations? And when do you feel like it really does need to be a human? And you can get personal with your response here. You don't have to be like best practices. You, Brooke B. Sellas, how do you feel regarding the use of chatbots and or AI with brand conversations?
It's funny that you say this because I recorded an episode of my podcast today and we had this exact conversation. So, what's happening right now in the world, because I know this won't come out today, is that a lot of people, including Elon Musk, asked that there be a pause put on generative AI because it's causing problems. And I'll give you an example. Facebook last year spent $1 billion to acquire a company called Customer with a K. And essentially, they spent $1 billion on this because what that company did was create generative chatbots. So think chat GPT, generative predictive text. And they were going to be able to handle a lot of customer support through these bots. But what ended up happening is that these bots created their own language. They started talking to each other rather than the customer, and they actually became sentient. They were judgmental towards the test customer, they were dismissive towards the test customer, they gave wrong information, they gave repetitive information. So I would say if you're talking about using like a generative type bot right now for customer care, I might hold off on that because that could very quickly tank your customer's experience.
That is horrifying. They started speaking their own language to each other?
Yeah,
That
it's bananas.
that's messed up. All right, so AI maybe not ready for prime time, but of course, when it comes to chatbots, you can have a human put in how those are used. I've heard of people using them to cut through frequently asked questions with simple
Yes.
answers in order to help get to a human and have a better conversation. So, how do you feel about the use of chatbots in that way? And what are some best and worst practices, even when it
Mhm.
comes to putting brand conversations into that type of model?
So, all of the enterprise science clients that we work with, you'd be surprised to know they don't use any bots at all. And that's typically because of the products that they're selling. One is a luxury, very high end product. So, their customer at that price point does not want to talk to a bot. And the other one, which I was giving the printer example, a lot of the troubleshooting questions are so specific. And by the time that customer comes to us to ask for help, they're really frustrated. So they typically do not want to speak to a bot. I am not against bots though. However, I think if you use a traditional bot, not something that's generative or predictive perhaps, you can set up a conversational workflow for your FAQs or frequently asked questions, and that bot can answer that questions 100% of the time, 24/7 with 100% accuracy. So as you're doing that audit to understand like what are the conversations that are happening on our social channels, if you see that all of them are FAQs, where are you located? What time do you close? Do you have an ATM on site, for a financial brand? If there's simple questions like that, set up a bot. Set up a bot, set up those conversational workflows, and you've just saved yourself a lot of time and money. But if it's more difficult, if it's somebody asking about insurance or finding a doctor that's in network or troubleshooting a printer jam, and they're coming to you when they're already flustered, I would say proceed with caution.
Have you delved into SMS, text message conversations at all in your brand conversation work?
We have, and again, it just depends on the client and the industry. I think the clients who do a better job of, connecting with their customers and their would-be customers see better results for the SMS programs. Whereas the brands who are just using SMS as a sales channel, just kind of like the same brands that are using social as a sales channel only, buy my stuff, buy my stuff, buy my stuff. We all know, well, I think we all know the answer, which is it doesn't go very well.
What are some practices that you recommend when it comes to, so you mentioned social listening before, and of
Mm.
course, proactively joining conversations that people are having about your brand. What are some guidelines as to when and how to hop in? Because I'm sure sometimes it could be seen as, intrusive, but sometimes it's a really good opportunity. So, how should brands assess that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to think about. One thing I'd like to point out too, though, is that I don't think brands realize the power of brand conversations. So, Twitter and Publicis did a report earlier this year that looked at people who use social media to research new brands to buy all that good stuff that brands want happening. And what they found was that these shoppers prefer brand conversation over online reviews, meaning they literally go to these brand pages to see if the brand is responding, to see what the conversations are. They're also looking at peer conversations where me and Christine are on Twitter bantering about a brand, but not necessarily tagging them, right? So social listening is so important because yes, you can be tagged as a brand and that would show up in your notifications. However, a lot of times people aren't tagging you, or they're mistagging you, or they're misspelling your name, or they're talking about your products and not the brand. So they're not tagging a product. So if you're not using social listening, you're missing out on all of those conversations. You can't enter the conversation as the brand, which then hurts that perception of those shoppers who are looking at brand conversation to help make that buying decision.
And now that brings up an interesting question, which is, of course, we're told that the DMs are really where the gold is. Dark social is where we want to get to, where we're having a direct conversation in the DMs with the client as the brand. But to that end, sometimes having those public conversations can be even better. It shows that our brand is listening. It's another brand touch. Maybe we're answering a question that other people might have and didn't ask, but we're answering that person who did ask it and thus helping
Mhm.
others learn more about our brand. So, how do you recommend playing that in terms of the conversations that should happen in public versus getting into those DMs? And do you even think that dark social is the end goal in that case?
I am not a fan of dark social. I'm actually a fan of that public social because of the stat that I just told you. It was shoppers who are looking at the conversation, but also because of this. When consumers see that brands are joining in the conversation, even if it's negative, which this is where a lot of brands, they don't like being vulnerable, obviously. So when there's a negative conversation, they want to move that to a private DM. However, this research shows that when shoppers see a brand conversation, even if it's negative, so even if Brooke comes on and says, I'm having a problem with your printer, I hate your brand, I hate your ink, blah, blah, blah. If the brand steps in and says, oh my gosh, Brooke, I'm so sorry. We'd love to help you with this right away. Please DM us your address so we can, or your email so we can resolve this, whatever. The consumer looking at that conversation 86% of those consumers only remember the positive part. They remember the part where the brand came in and said, "We listen, we care, we want to fix this for you." They don't necessarily remember that somebody was complaining about the brand. So I know dark social exists and there's an absolute time and place for it, but I'm a fan of doing your work in public, especially when it comes to customer experience.
All right. Well, I should have prepared you for this and I didn't because I like letting the conversations flow, but I would love to close this out by hearing some of the most common missteps you see brands making when it comes to conversations that are going to really do their brand some good, and some of the top missed opportunities that brands maybe should be doing in order to have those conversations benefit the brand. So let's start with the missteps, if we may. What are brands messing up?
Well, first and foremost, you have to respond. You have to respond to every message that you get, unless it's like, something that you might hide because it's spam or, inflammatory. Um, and you have to do it quickly. Research shows also the brands that are first to answer those acquisition questions, because you better believe Brooke didn't just ask you, she asked that question to the top 3 people on her list who she's looking to buy from. The people and brands who respond the fastest to those acquisition questions, much of the time, it's not quite 100%, but it's almost up there, get the sale. So you not only have to answer everything, you have to answer it quickly. And I think instead of creating content all the time, you need to start thinking about how you can have conversations, lead conversations on your brand pages on social. Because again, shoppers are looking to those conversations to decide if they want to buy from you.
All right. Now, what are some of those opportunities out there in the world of brand conversations that you're really excited about and that more brands should really be taking advantage of?
You mentioned it earlier, social listening. I think it's bananas that not every brand is using social listening because there are so many conversations happening around your brand where you aren't tagged or mentioned so that you wouldn't see come into your inbox. So to get from customer service, which is reactive, to customer care, which is proactive and includes acquisition, you really need to be using social listening to find those conversations. And sure, it may just be, you may be just a lurker in that conversation. You could passively use social listening for voice of customer information, but you could actively join those conversations as well and gently guide the conversation towards connection, conversation, and then hopefully maybe conversion.
Sorry, I know we're towards the end of our time, but for those wondering how to even get started with social listening, I mean, what is that really? What do they do besides obviously, Googling their brand name?
Yeah, Googling your brand name's not going to do it. There are a ton of tools out there. They're all wonderful. I would say do your homework. So for what I tell our clients when they're searching for a social listening tool is say, I tell them to have a goal, right? When you go on that demo for that social listening tool, know what you want to prove and tell that person who's demoing the tool for you, I'm looking to do this. Show me how your tool will help me achieve that. And if they can't show you, move on to the next tool. But there's so many out there depending on budget. Agora Pulse has social listening, Sprout Social has social listening, Sprinkler has social listening. There's also social listening only programs like NetBase. So there really are a million and one tools. I did co-create a social listening workbook with Sprout Social. It's totally free. I will make sure that I give the link to Christine for the show notes because it's on Sprout Social site and it's kind of a long link, but I'll make sure I share it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Everyone make sure to check that out. And Brooke, everyone should make sure to check you out. So please tell the good folks at home where they can find you, why they should find you, and what they will find there.
Well, thank you for that. You can go to our website, which is b-squared.media. You'll see information on my book. I've got chapter 1 of the book available for you to read. I've got some free case studies on social media customer care with our clients and also just research papers. So all of that's free to you to check out. And then if you just want to connect with me and continue the conversation, which obviously I love, you can just Google Brooke Sellas, Brookesellas. I think I'm the only Brooke Sellas on the planet, so you'll find me.
I love that. I'm the only Christine Gritmon on the planet. It's good SEO. Good
And nice
SEO
and
there.
easy.
And you also have a podcast, do you not?
I do. Yes. I just launched a new podcast called The CX Engine Show. And that is where we talk all about customer experience. And the great thing about the show is that we're interviewing practitioners who work at brands. So you're actually talking to people who have boots on the ground and they have amazing ideas when it comes to launching and deploying CX and EX employee experience initiatives.
Ah, fantastic. This has been a wonderful conversation about conversations, Brooke. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much for listening to Let's Talk About Brand. If you're listening on your podcast player of choice, make sure to subscribe to Let's Talk About Brand on the Adweek Podcast Network. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, subscribe here to my Christine Gritmon Inc. channel, where the Monday podcast will always be launched as a Friday video. And of course, if you'd like to talk to me about your brand, I can always be found at gritmon.com. Thanks so much. Bye.